Lily Chen wiped down the same table for the third time, her hands shaking slightly as she glanced at the clock on the diner wall. It was almost closing time, and she hadn't made enough in tips today to cover even half of what she needed. The crumpled hospital bill in her apron pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Another coffee refill, honey?" she asked the elderly man sitting alone in the corner booth. He'd been coming in every Tuesday for the past month, always ordering the same thing, black coffee and apple pie. Always left a decent tip too, which was more than she could say for most customers. "Please," Theodore Ashworth said quietly, pushing his cup toward her. At 73, he still carried himself with the posture of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms, though his expensive suits seemed too big for his thin frame these days. Lily poured the coffee, noticing how he always seemed to be watching her, not in a creepy way, more like he was trying to figure something out. She'd grown used to it over the weeks. "You look tired today," he observed, his voice gentle. Lily forced a smile. "Just a long day. Nothing I can't handle." But that wasn't true, and they both knew it. Dark circles had taken permanent residence under her eyes, and her uniform hung loose on her shrinking frame. When you're working 2 jobs and barely sleeping, your body starts to show it whether you want it to or not. The bell above the door chimed as the last customer left. Lily began her closing routine, stacking chairs and wiping down surfaces while Theodore remained in his booth. Usually, he'd be gone by now. "Lily," he said suddenly, "may I ask you something personal?" She paused, mop in hand. In all their brief interactions, he'd never asked about her life. "I guess so. You're working yourself to death. What's driving you so hard?" The question hit her like a punch to the stomach. For a moment, she considered giving him the standard, "everything's fine" response she gave everyone else, but something about his kind eyes made her defenses crumble. "My little brother Jake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's got leukemia. The treatments are expensive and our insurance doesn't cover everything. Mom's already working 3 jobs and Dad left when Jake got sick. Couldn't handle it, I guess." She kept mopping, focusing on the repetitive motion to keep herself from breaking down. "The doctors say Jake's responding well to treatment, but if we can't keep up with the payments, they might have to change his care plan. I can't let that happen. He's only 12. Theodore was quiet for a long moment. When Lily finally looked up, she saw something in his expression she couldn't quite identify. Understanding, maybe, or recognition. "How much do you need?" he asked. Lily laughed, but there was no humor in it. "More than I'll ever have. Between the current bills and what's coming, we're looking at about $200,000 over the next year." She expected him to change the subject or make his excuses to leave. Instead, Theodore did something that would change her life forever. "Marry me," he said. Lily dropped the mop. "Excuse me?" "I know how it sounds," Theodore continued calmly. "I'm an old man and you're a beautiful young woman, but I'm also very wealthy and you need help. It would be a business arrangement, nothing more. You'd have access to the best medical care for your brother, and I'd have companionship in my final years." "Are you insane?" Lily stared at him. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Theodore replied. "I know you've been working 16-hour days for weeks. I know you give most of your tips to the single mother at table 6 when she can't afford her meal. I know you stayed after closing last week to help that homeless man who was looking for work. You have character, Lily. That's rarer than you might think." Lily's mind was reeling. This couldn't be happening. "I can't marry someone I barely know. That's crazy. Crazier than watching your brother suffer because you can't afford his treatment?" The words stung because they were true. She'd been having nightmares about exactly that scenario for weeks. "I'm not asking you to love me," Theodore said gently. "I'm offering you a solution to your problem. You'd live in my house, we'd have meals together occasionally, and you'd be free to visit your family whenever you want. In return, your brother gets the best care money can buy, and your mother can quit those extra jobs." Lily sank into the chair, across from him. "Why would you do this? What's in it for you?" Theodore's eyes grew distant. I've been alone for a very long time. My wife died 15 years ago and we never had children. This house I live in feels more like a tomb than a home. Maybe having someone around would make it feel alive again. But why me? You could find someone your own age. Someone more appropriate. Appropriate. Theodore smiled sadly. I've been around appropriate people my whole life. Lawyers, business, partners, socialites. They all want something from me and none of them care about a sick child or a struggling family. You're different. Lily thought about Jake, pale and tired from his last round of chemotherapy. She thought about her mother's hands, raw from working as a cleaning lady at 3 different buildings. She thought about the bills that kept coming, each one a reminder of how powerless she felt. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course, but don't take too long. Your brother's next treatment is scheduled for next week, isn't it? He knew. Somehow this strange old man knew about Jake's treatment schedule. It should have scared her, but instead it made her realize how serious he was about this bizarre proposal. 3 days later, Lily said yes. The wedding was small and quick, held at the courthouse with only her mother and Jake as witnesses. Theodore's lawyer was there too, along with a photographer who documented everything with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. As they signed the papers, Lily caught her reflection in the window. She looked like a ghost in her simple white dress, pale, scared, and completely out of place. But when she looked at Jake, grinning despite his bald head and thin frame, she knew she'd made the right choice. The ride to Theodore's estate was silent. Lily pressed her face against the window of his expensive car, watching familiar neighborhoods disappear behind them. They drove through increasingly upscale areas until finally turning through massive iron gates. The house, no, mansion, that came into view took her breath away. It was bigger than her entire apartment building, with perfectly manicured grounds and more windows than she could count. Welcome home, Theodore said quietly as they pulled up to the front entrance. Home. Lily almost laughed at the word. This place looked like something from a movie, not like anywhere she could ever call home. But as she stepped out of the car and looked up at the imposing structure that was now somehow hers too, one thought kept running through her mind. Jake was going to live. Whatever else happened, her little brother was going to live. And for now, that was enough. The first thing Lily noticed about her new bedroom was the silence. Not the peaceful kind of quiet she'd hoped for after years of thin apartment walls and noisy neighbors. This was different. Thick, heavy silence that seemed to press down on her chest and make her feel like she was holding her breath. The room was beautiful, she had to admit. Bigger than her entire old apartment, with a 4-poster bed that looked like it belonged in a palace and windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. Everything was perfect, too perfect. The pillows were fluffed just right, the curtains hung without a single wrinkle, and not a speck of dust could be found anywhere. It felt more like a hotel room than a place where someone actually lived. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, had shown her around with the kind of polite coldness that made Lily's skin crawl. The older woman's eyes had taken in every detail of Lily's appearance, her cheap shoes, her discount store clothes, the way she touched things hesitantly like she was afraid of breaking something expensive. Dinner is served at 7 sharp, Mrs. Patterson had said, her voice crisp and professional. Mr. Ashworth prefers punctuality. The East Wing is his private study and office area. He's not to be disturbed during his work hours, which are typically 9 to 6. Lily had nodded along, feeling smaller with each rule and regulation. This wasn't a home. It was an institution with visiting hours. That first dinner had been the most awkward hour of her life. The dining room was massive, with a table that could seat 20 people. Theodore sat at one end, she sat at the other, and between them stretched what felt like an ocean of polished wood. A uniformed server had brought course after course of food she couldn't pronounce while she and Theodore made stilted conversation about the weather and current events. "How is your brother?" Theodore had asked during the main course. "Good," Lily replied, cutting her steak into tiny pieces to give her hand something to do. "The hospital called today. They're starting his next round of treatment tomorrow. The Doctors seem optimistic. I'm glad to hear it, and that was it. Back to silence and the soft clink of expensive silverware on expensive plates. By the third day, Lily had established a routine that mostly involved avoiding Theodore altogether. She'd wake up in her too-perfect room, eat breakfast alone in the smaller morning room while Theodore was already locked away in his study, then spend her days wandering the enormous house like a ghost. The mansion was full of beautiful things, oil paintings that probably cost more than most people made in a centavo year, sculptures from artists she'd only heard about in movies, and enough antique furniture to stock a museum. But none of it felt real to her. It was like walking through a catalog instead of a home. She'd tried calling her mother on the second day, desperate to hear a familiar voice. "How's the new place, honey?" her mom had asked, and Lily could hear the worry underneath the cheerful tone. "It's fine," Lily had lied, staring out at the perfectly manicured gardens. "Really nice. Theodore's been very kind." That wasn't entirely true either. Theodore wasn't unkind, he was just absent. Since that first dinner, she'd barely seen him except for brief glimpses as he moved between his study and other parts of the house she apparently wasn't welcome in. When they did cross paths, he'd nod politely and ask if she needed anything, but there was no warmth in it, no connection. The staff wasn't much better. Besides Mrs. Patterson, there was James the butler, Maria the cook, and 2 other housekeepers, whose names Lily still hadn't learned. They were all perfectly professional and perfectly distant. She'd tried to help in the kitchen once, offering to make her own lunch, but Maria had looked so horrified at the suggestion that Lily had backed away, apologizing. Mrs. Ashworth shouldn't concern herself with such things, Maria had said, the title sounding strange and foreign in Lily's ears. Mrs. Ashworth. That's who she was now, apparently. But she didn't feel like anyone's wife. She felt like an intruder, like someone who'd won a contest she'd never entered, and now had to live with the prize whether she wanted it or not. On the 4th night, she'd heard music coming from somewhere in the house. Classical piano played with skill and feeling. She'd followed the sound through hallways lined with family portraits of people she didn't recognize, until she found herself outside a partially open door. Through the gap, she could see Theodore at a grand piano, his fingers moving across the keys with surprising grace for someone his age. The music was beautiful and sad, full of longing and old memories. For a moment, Lily had seen him not as the distant stranger she'd married, but as a person who felt things deeply, someone who maybe understood loneliness as well as she did. But when the music stopped and Theodore looked up, their eyes had met through the doorway. Instead of inviting her in or even acknowledging the moment they'd shared, he'd simply closed the piano and left the room through another door, leaving her standing in the hallway feeling more alone than ever. By the end of the first week, Lily was questioning everything. Sure, Jake's medical bills were being paid and her mother had been able to quit 2 of her 3 jobs. The relief on her family's faces when she'd told them about the marriage arrangement had been worth almost anything. Almost. But as she lay in her fancy bed on the 7th night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the oppressive silence, she wondered if she'd traded one kind of prison for another. Her old life had been hard, full of worry and exhaustion, but at least it had been hers. At least she'd felt like a real person instead of an expensive decoration in someone else's perfect house. She'd gotten up and wandered to one of the big windows, looking out at the grounds bathed in moonlight. Everything was so beautiful and so empty, like a postcard of someone else's life. The worst part was Theodore himself. During their brief interaction, she'd caught glimpses of something interesting underneath all that formal politeness. The way he'd known about Jake's treatment schedule suggested he cared about details that mattered to her. The piano playing showed he had depth and feeling, but he kept all of that locked away, treating her like a business associate instead of someone sharing his home. Maybe that's all she was to him, a business arrangement, just like he'd said. Someone to fill the empty spaces in his house without actually touching his life. She was there to make the mansion feel less lonely, but she wasn't supposed to actually know him or let him know her. As she stood at the window, watching shadows move across the perfect lawn, Lily made a decision. She couldn't live like this, not for months or years. Something had to change, even if she had to force it to happen. Tomorrow she was going to stop tiptoeing around like a guest in her own supposed home. She was going to figure out who Theodore Ashworth really was, and why a man with everything money could buy still felt the need to play such sad, lonely music. When he thought no one was listening, little did she know that tomorrow would bring answers to questions she hadn't even thought to ask. Lily had always been a reader. Even during the worst days when she was working 2 jobs and barely sleeping, she'd find 20 minutes before bed to escape into a book. It was her one luxury, her way of traveling to places far from hospital bills and empty refrigerators. So when she woke up on her 8th morning in the mansion with nothing to do and nowhere to go, the first thing she wanted was something to read. She'd finished the romance novel she'd brought with her, and the idea of spending another day wandering empty hallways was enough to make her want to scream. Theodore had already disappeared into his study, following his usual routine. Mrs. Patterson was somewhere in the house doing whatever housekeepers do in mansions. The other staff members moved around like quiet ghosts, always busy but never seeming to accomplish anything Lily could actually see. She decided to look for a library. A house this size had to have one, right? Rich people always had libraries, in movies full of leather-bound books and comfortable reading chairs. Her search took her through parts of the mansion she hadn't explored yet. She passed rooms that looked like they belonged in a magazine, a formal sitting room with furniture that probably cost more than her old car, a music room with that beautiful piano she'd heard Theodore playing, and what looked like a small ballroom, with chandeliers that sparkled even in the dim light. Finally, on the 2nd floor, she found what she was looking for. The library was everything she'd imagined and more. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with thousands of books, tall windows that let in streams of golden sunlight, and several comfortable reading chairs positioned perfectly for a quiet afternoon. Lily ran her fingers along the spines of the books, reading titles by authors she recognized and many she didn't. Classic literature mixed with modern novels, books on history and science, travel guides to places she'd only dreamed of visiting. Theodore had excellent taste in books, she had to admit. She was reaching for a novel that looked interesting when something odd caught her eye. One section of the bookshelf looked different from the others, newer somehow, like it had been built or modified recently. The wood was the same, but the color was just slightly off, as if it had been added later. Curious, she ran her hands along the edge of the newer section. Her fingers found a small indent in the wood, almost like a button. Without really thinking about what she was doing, she pressed it. The entire section of bookshelf swung inward with a soft click, revealing a hidden room behind it. Lily's heart started pounding. She knew she shouldn't go in there. This was obviously Theodore's private space, and she was already walking on thin ice with the household staff. But the opening was right there, and she could see light coming from inside. Just a quick look wouldn't hurt anyone, would it? She stepped through the opening and gasped. The hidden room was an office, but not like any office she'd ever seen. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them. Pictures of children in hospital beds, families standing in front of new houses, elderly people receiving medical care, young adults in graduation caps and gowns. In the center of the room was a large desk covered with files, letters, and what looked like financial documents, but these weren't business papers. As Lily moved closer, she could see they were all related to charitable giving. A letter on top of one stack caught her attention. It was handwritten in shaky script. "Dear Mr. Ashworth, I can't thank you enough for paying for my grandson's surgery. The doctors say he's going to make a full recovery. You saved his life, and our family will never forget your kindness." Another letter, typed this time. "The new community center is already helping so many families in our neighborhood. The kids have a safe place to go after school, and the adults can take classes to learn new skills. You've changed our entire community for the better." Lily picked up file after file, each one containing documentation of Theodore's charitable work. Medical bills paid in full for families who couldn't afford treatment. College scholarships given to students who showed promise but lacked funds. Down payments provided for first-time homebuyers in low-income neighborhoods. Small business loans given to entrepreneurs who couldn't get traditional financing. The amounts were staggering. Theodore wasn't just giving away pocket change. He was giving away millions of dollars every year, and had been doing it for decades. She found a thick photo album and opened it with trembling hands. The first page showed a young girl, maybe 8 years old, in a hospital bed. She was bald from chemotherapy, but she was smiling and holding a stuffed animal. A note attached to the photo read, "Lucy's treatment, fully funded. She's now cancer-free and in her second year of college." Page after page showed similar stories. Children who'd received life-saving medical care, families who'd been able to keep their homes during financial crises, veterans who'd received help transitioning back to civilian life, single mothers who'd been able to go back to school. Lily sank into the chair behind the desk, overwhelmed by what she was seeing. All this time, she'd thought Theodore was just a cold, lonely old man who'd married her out of selfish need for companionship. But he was so much more than that. A folder marked current projects lay open in front of her. She probably shouldn't look, but she couldn't help herself. The first document made her gasp out loud. It was Jake's medical file, along with complete documentation of his treatment plan and all associated costs. But that wasn't what shocked her. At the bottom of the page, in Theodore's handwriting, was a note. "Brother of Lily Chen. Ensure he receives best possible care regardless of cost. Priority case. Priority case." Theodore had been watching out for Jake before he'd even met her properly, before he'd made his marriage proposal. She flipped through more files and found documentation for other families in her old neighborhood. The single mother at the diner who'd been struggling to pay rent. Theodore had quietly paid her back rent and set up a fund to help with future payments. The homeless man Lily had tried to help find work. Theodore had not only found him a job, but had also paid for temporary housing and work clothes. How had he known about these people? How had he known about her family's situation before she told him? The answer came in the form of a detailed report from a private investigator. Theodore had been having her followed, not in a creepy way, but in a protective way. He'd been watching how she interacted with people, how she treated those less fortunate than herself, how she sacrificed for her family. A business card fell out of one of the files. Henderson Private Investigation Services, discreet background, checks and character assessments. There was a handwritten note attached. Subject shows exceptional character. Recommend proceeding with plan. Plan. Theodore's marriage proposal hadn't been spontaneous at all. He'd been planning it, studying her, making sure she was the kind of person who would use his help responsibly and not take advantage of his generosity. But why keep it all secret? Why not tell people about the amazing work he was doing? She found her answer in a newspaper clipping from several years ago. The headline read, "Local businessman harassed by fortune seekers." The article described how Theodore had once made his charitable work public, only to be overwhelmed by people asking for money, some with legitimate needs and others who were clearly trying to take advantage. After that, he'd gone underground with his giving, working through intermediaries and private investigators to find people who truly needed help and wouldn't misuse. Lily sat back in the chair, her mind reeling. She'd married a man she thought she barely knew, only to discover he was quietly changing the world, one family at a time. The cold, distant stranger she'd been living with for a week was actually one of the most compassionate people she'd ever encountered. No wonder he'd seemed to understand her desperation about Jake's medical bills. He'd been helping families in similar situations for years. Suddenly, she heard footsteps in the library outside. Panic shot through her as she realized Theodore might be coming. She quickly closed the files and photo albums, trying to put everything back exactly as she'd found it. But as she reached for the hidden door, she realized something had changed. She couldn't go back to the polite, distant relationship they'd been maintaining. Not now that she knew who he really was. Theodore Ashworth wasn't the cold businessman she'd thought she'd married. He was a hero hiding in plain sight. And she was going to find out why he felt the need to hide it all. Lily spent the rest of that day in a state of nervous energy she couldn't shake. Every time she saw Theodore from across the house, her heart would start racing. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say a dozen times, but the words never came out right in her head. How do you confront someone about being secretly amazing? She waited until after dinner, when Theodore had retreated to his study as usual. This time, instead of accepting the invisible barrier that had kept them apart all week, She walked straight to his door and knocked. "Come in," his voice called, sounding surprised. No one ever disturbed him during his evening hours. Theodore looked up from his desk when she entered, his reading glasses perched on his nose and papers spread out in front of him. For a moment, he looked almost grandfatherly instead of like the intimidating businessman she'd been tiptoeing around. "Lily, is everything all right? Do you need something?" She closed the door behind her and took a deep breath. "I found your secret room." The color drained from Theodore's face. He set down his pen very carefully and removed his glasses, suddenly looking much older than his 73 years. "I see." His voice was quiet, controlled. "I suppose you think you know what kind of man I am now?" "I do," Lily said, moving closer to his desk. "But probably not in the way you think." Theodore stood up abruptly, turning away from her to face the window. "You shouldn't have gone in there. That room is private." "Why?" The question came out stronger than she'd intended. "Why keep all of that hidden? Do you know how many people you've helped? How many lives you've saved?" "It's not that simple," Theodore said, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "Then explain it to me." Lily moved around the desk so she could see his face. "Help me understand why you let people think you're just some cold, rich old man when you're actually out there changing the world." Theodore was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark gardens. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. 20 years ago, I made the mistake of being public about my charitable work. I thought it might inspire others to give or at least help people know that help was available." He shook his head. "It was the worst decision I ever made." "What happened?" "Everything changed. I couldn't go anywhere without being surrounded by people asking for money. My phone rang constantly. People showed up at my office, at my home, even at my wife's grave when I went to visit her." Lily felt her heart clench at the mention of his wife. "Most of them had real needs," Theodore continued. "But some didn't. Some were professional con artists who saw me as an easy target. Others were people who figured they deserved my money, more than whoever I was already helping. It became impossible to tell the difference between genuine need and manipulation." He turned to face her, and she could see years of hurt in his eyes. The worst part was watching how it changed the people I was trying to help. Families who had been grateful for assistance started demanding more. Children I'd put through college came back expecting me to pay for their weddings, their houses, their own children's education. Some threatened to go to the media if I said no, claiming I'd promised them things I never promised. Lily was beginning to understand. "So you went underground?" "I had to. The only way to actually help people was to do it quietly, without them knowing where the help was coming from. That way, they couldn't come back for more, and they couldn't tell others who might take advantage." "But doesn't it hurt?" Lily asked. "Helping all those people and never getting to see their gratitude? Never getting thanked?" Theodore's expression softened slightly. "The thank you letters find their way to me eventually. Through lawyers, through the private investigators, through intermediaries. I see the children grow up healthy, the families build better lives, the communities improve. That's enough. Is that why you had me investigated? To make sure I wasn't after your money?" "Partly," Theodore admitted, "but mostly to understand what kind of person you really were. I'd been watching you at the diner for months, Lily. I saw how you treated everyone with kindness even when you were exhausted. I saw you give your own food to people who couldn't afford to eat. I saw you stay late to help that young mother with her crying baby when she was overwhelmed." He sat back down in his chair, suddenly looking tired. "When I learned about your brother's illness and your family's financial situation, I knew I wanted to help, but I also saw an opportunity for something I'd been missing for a very long time." "What's that?" "Companionship without ulterior motives. Someone who might share my home without constantly calculating how much they could get from me." He looked up at her with something that might have been hope. "I thought if we married for practical reasons, if you got what you needed up front, then whatever relationship we built afterward would be genuine." Lily sank into the chair across from his desk, processing everything she'd learned. "You've been alone for so long," she said quietly. 15 years, Theodore confirmed. My wife Victoria was the only person who knew about my charitable work and supported it without asking for anything for herself. After she died, I couldn't risk letting anyone else get that close. Until now. Why now? Why me? Theodore was quiet, for a moment choosing his words carefully. Because you remind me of her. Not in appearance, but in character. Victoria used to volunteer at the local soup kitchen every weekend. She'd come home with stories about the people she'd met, the small ways she'd been able to help. She understood that real generosity isn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It's about seeing someone who needs help and quietly doing what you can. Lily felt tears stinging her eyes. She sounds wonderful. She was. And so are you, in your own way. That's why I knew you'd understand what I do even if I wasn't ready to tell you about it yet. But you are ready now? It wasn't the love story Lily had dreamed of as a young girl, but it was something perhaps more valuable. A partnership built on mutual respect, shared goals, and the quiet satisfaction of Theodore smiled for the first time since she'd entered his study. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less burdened. I suppose I don't have much choice, do I? You've already seen everything. Lily laughed, feeling lighter than she had since arriving at the mansion. I have a lot of questions. I imagine you do, and I'll answer them if you'd like. But first, I have a question for you. What's that? Now that you know what I do with my money and my time, are you still willing to be part of this arrangement? It's not just about sharing my house anymore. If you stay, you'll be part of something much bigger. Lily thought about Jake, healthy and cancer-free because of Theodore's generosity. She thought about all the families in those photographs, living better lives because one man had decided to use his wealth to help instead of hoard it. She thought about the possibility of being part of that work, of making a real difference in the world. I'm not just willing, she said. I want to help. I want to be part of what you're doing. Theodore's smile grew wider. In that case, Mrs. Ashworth, I think we have a lot to talk about. For the first time since their wedding, the title didn't sound strange to her ears. It sounded like the beginning of something real. 3 months later, Lily barely recognized the mansion she'd first walked into as a nervous bride. The same hallways that had once felt cold and empty now buzzed with quiet activity. The formal dining room had been converted into a workspace where she and Theodore reviewed applications for help, and the sitting room had become an informal meeting area where they interviewed families in need. The change hadn't happened overnight. Those first few weeks after their honest conversation had been awkward in a completely different way. Instead of polite distance, they'd been learning how to work together, how to trust each other's judgment, and how to navigate the delicate process of helping people without making them feel like charity cases. Lily's first suggestion had been simple, but revolutionary. What if we actually met some of these families? She'd asked, looking through a stack of applications. I know you like to keep your distance, but wouldn't it help to see their situations firsthand? Theodore had been hesitant at first. Years of maintaining anonymity weren't easy to overcome, but Lily's enthusiasm was infectious, and her perspective, as someone who'd recently been on the receiving end of help, was invaluable. Their first joint visit had been to the Rodriguez family. Their 8-year-old daughter needed surgery that insurance wouldn't cover, and the medical bills were threatening to bankrupt them. Instead of sending a check through lawyers, Lily had convinced Theodore to visit their small apartment personally. We're not here as Mr. and Mrs. Ashworth, Lily had explained during the drive. We're here as friends who want to help. The difference had been remarkable. Instead of the formal gratitude Theodore was used to receiving through letters, he'd gotten to see little Maria's face light up when they told her the surgery was taken care of. He'd gotten to shake her father's hand and hear directly how much the help meant to their family. She can grow up normal now, Maria's mother had said through tears. She can run and play like other children. You've given us our daughter's future back. That night, Theodore had been quieter than usual, but it was a thoughtful quiet instead of the lonely silence Lily had grown used to. I'd forgotten, he'd said finally, as they sat in his study reviewing other cases. Forgotten what? How good. It feels to see happiness up close. Letters are wonderful, but seeing a parent's relief when their child will be okay, he'd trailed off, shaking his head. I'd forgotten how much I missed that connection. From that point on, they'd made personal visits a regular part of their work. Not for every case. Some situations required anonymity for safety or privacy reasons. But whenever possible, they met the people they were helping. Lily had also brought a fresh perspective to the types of help they provided. Theodore's giving had always been reactive, responding to crises and urgent needs. But Lily suggested they also focus on prevention and long-term solutions. What if we helped people before they hit rock bottom, she'd asked. Like job training programs or financial literacy classes, or childcare support so single parents can work or go to school. The idea had led to their biggest project yet, a community center in Lily's old neighborhood that provided everything from after-school programs to adult education classes to small business mentoring. Instead of just fixing problems, they were helping people build better lives. The project had also brought an unexpected benefit. Working together on something meaningful had gradually broken down the last barriers between them. They weren't just sharing a house anymore, they were sharing a mission. Their daily routine had evolved naturally. Mornings were spent in Theodore's study, now their joint office, reviewing applications and planning visits. Afternoons often involved trips to meet families or check on ongoing projects. Evenings were for quiet conversation over dinner, real conversation, not the stilted politeness of their early days. You know, Theodore had said one evening as they discussed a particularly challenging case, I never expected this. What? To actually enjoy having someone to share this work with. I thought I'd gotten used to doing everything alone. Lily had smiled at that. I never expected to enjoy it either. I thought I was just trading one kind of survival for another. I didn't expect to find something I was actually good at. And she was good at it. Her background had given her insights Theodore could never have had. She understood what it felt like to choose between groceries and medical bills, to work multiple jobs and still fall behind, to feel invisible in a world that seemed designed for people with money. That understanding made her incredibly effective at connecting with the families they helped. She also had a gift for seeing solutions Theodore might miss. When they'd visited an elderly man whose medical expenses were draining his savings, Theodore's instinct had been to pay the bills. But Lily had noticed the man's small garden and his mention of being lonely since his wife died. What if we connect him with the community center? She'd suggested. He could teach gardening classes to kids and maybe help with the community garden project. He gets social connection and purpose. The kids learn something valuable and he earns enough to help with those medical bills. The solution had worked beautifully. Mr. Patterson now spent 3 afternoons a week teaching neighborhood children how to grow vegetables, and his small income from the program had restored his dignity, along with his financial stability. Perhaps the biggest change was in Theodore himself. The distant, formal man she'd married was still there, but now she understood that his reserve came from years of protecting himself, not from coldness. When he relaxed, which happened more and more often, he was funny, thoughtful, and surprisingly, young at heart. She'd learned that he'd been a teacher before inheriting his family's business, which explained his patience with the children they met. She'd discovered that he played piano when he was thinking through problems, and that he'd written poetry as a young man. Most importantly, she'd seen how much joy he got from their work together, how alive he became when he was making a real difference in someone's life. The revelation that had surprised her most came during a visit to Jake's latest checkup. Her brother was doing wonderfully. The treatments had been successful and his prognosis was excellent. As they left the hospital, Jake had hugged Theodore goodbye, calling him Mr. T, with the easy affection of a kid who'd never learned to be intimidated by wealth. He likes you, Lily had observed as they drove home. I like him too. He reminds me of myself at that age, curious about everything, never satisfied with simple answers. You would have been a good father, Lily had said without thinking, then immediately worried she'd overstepped. But Theodore had just smiled sadly. Victoria and I tried for years. It wasn't meant to be. But maybe this work, helping all these families, is another way of nurturing the next generation. 6 months after their awkward courthouse wedding, as Lily sat in what was now truly their shared study, reviewing applications and planning their next community project, she realized something that would have shocked her younger self. She was happy. Not just content or grateful, but genuinely happy in a way she'd never experienced before. She'd found purpose, partnership, and something that felt surprisingly like love, not the passionate romance of movies, but something deeper and more sustainable: respect, trust, shared values, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Theodore looked up from his desk and caught her smiling. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Just that Jake's checkup went well, and that the Martinez family is moving into their new house next week, and that Mrs. Kim's bakery is finally turning a profit." "All good things," Theodore agreed. "Very good things," Lily said. "I was also thinking that this turned out differently than either of us expected." Theodore set down his pen and really looked at her, something he'd started doing more often lately. "Better than I expected," he said quietly. "Much better." Outside their window, the perfectly manicured gardens were being redesigned.